Hey everybody, Katie Kimball here from Kids Cook Real Food, and I'm honored to be in person with Dr. Nicole Beurkens of the Horizons Center. We're actually local to each other, which is a rare find and so fun. And we're going to talk today about some really interesting feeding issues that I know a lot of the audience sees in their kids or wonders about in their kids, and I'm super excited to jump in. Dr. Beurkens, you have a really robust and varied background and such a breadth of experience. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, what passions led you through your education to where you are today?
Sure, absolutely. I had a very winding path that took me to where I am today. I started my career in special education, actually, working with kids with more severe emotional and behavioral disorders, autism, severe ADHD, those kinds of things. And while I loved what I was doing in school with kids, I realized that I was only having an impact for about 6 hours a day. And I had parents of my students saying, show me what to do. Like, I see you doing these great things in school. I don't know what to do at home. Like, nobody's guiding me with really how to help my child. And so I really got interested in providing support to parents. And that led me to go back to school and get my doctorate in clinical psychology, because I really wanted to understand more about child development, parent-child relationships, and to be able to take families from the process of first having a concern about their child and maybe looking at diagnosis all the way through treatment. So I did that and opened the practice that we're sitting in today, which, the odds that we're like 5 minutes from each other, it's awesome. And opened the practice in 2003 to really be able to support families. And along the way, my interest in food and nutrition really came about because while we were doing great things with the educational pieces and the psychology pieces and specific interventions for kids with, neurodevelopmental issues, mental health issues, I really started to see patterns of physical issues in the kids that we were working with. Things like, chronic ear infections, allergies, really limited diets, things like that. And between seeing some things in my patients and then also noticing some things with my own kids, because I'm a mom of 4, I began really researching and delving into the connection between the food that we eat and our behavior and our cognitive functioning, and was amazed at all of this research that's out there that I had not learned in either my education training or my psychology training. And I began to realize, wait a second, we need to be working on this. We need to be talking with families about this. So began implementing a lot of things with my own children and then here at the clinic, and then went back and got a master's degree in nutrition and integrative health so that I could get board certified in nutrition, because I really wanted to bring that level of expertise to my work with families, to really understand and help parents understand how shifting the things that our kids are eating, using targeted nutrient intervention, using integrative lifestyle kinds of things, makes such a big difference in the symptoms that we're dealing with our kids. So that's how all those 3 components kind of came together and led me to doing sort of the integrative work that I do today with families here.
Oh, I just love that you started with education and then saw a need to be filled, went on to psychology, saw a need to be filled, went on to nutrition, and now you're really treating the whole person, which is cool. And the center here treats infant to adult, not just kids, which is very fantastic.
Absolutely.
Now, kids at the dinner table, kids eating, this can be a sticky situation for parents of all types of kids. And I actually do some presentations on bringing calm to the meal times and helping kids to eat more. And there are always these parents who are hearing my tips going, yeah, but my kid's way picky, way beyond that. And I touch a little bit on SPD, or sensory processing disorder, and a lot of people say, I really want to hear more about that. So that's kind of why we're here today. Can we start right at the basics, definition? What is sensory processing disorder?
So sensory processing disorder is a term that's been around for a while and that many families or parents are familiar with at this point, but I think there still is confusion about what that actually is. So sensory processing disorder refers to difficulties that happen in some children where their brain struggles to make sense of input coming from the sensory environment. So, we can think about, in school we learn about the 5 senses, right? There's some additional ones as well, but our brain has to interpret and make sense of that information. So information comes into our brain through touch, through smell, through vision, through those senses, and then the brain has to make sense of it so that we can react to it appropriately.
Sure.
In sensory processing disorder, what happens is the brain struggles to make sense of that input. So the sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, the touch, all of that's coming in like it is for any of the rest of us, but the brain is struggling to make sense of that quickly and effectively. So what you end up with is a couple of sort of categories of issues.
Okay.
Kids who are under responsive to sensation. So the input's coming in and their brain is not registering it at the level that it's at. So these are kids who maybe don't really notice smells to things, or that things have different smells, or kids who are under responsive to pain. You know, moms will say, he can fall down and like get a huge gash and doesn't really seem bothered by it, doesn't seem to notice. So there's under responsiveness.
Okay.
Then we have kids who go the other direction and they're very over responsive, and that tends to be more what people think about, the kids who everything's really loud and they have to cover their ears,
Sure.
or the kids who say everything smells bad and tastes bad and they're not going to eat it, or you know, certain feelings in their clothing or the seams of their socks. Those are the more overreactive or oversensitive brains, where normal sensory inputs are perceived by the brain as being much bigger and more averse than what they actually are. And you can have kids who have under responsiveness and over responsiveness at the same time to different types of things. So those tend to be kind of the categories of that. And you know, in addition to the 5 main senses that people typically think about, it's also important to know that there is a sense called the proprioceptive sense, which is the feel of pressure and gravity like on our muscles and our joints. So for example, if I pick up an empty laundry basket, my muscles feel the pressure of that differently than a full laundry basket, right? Like if I go to pick something up and I think it's going to be heavy and it ends up being light, it's like, whoa, right?
Sure.
Until the proprioception in my joints kicks in and says, oh wait, no, this is an empty thing, you know, put less pressure on it.
Uh-huh.
So there are kids who struggle to interpret proprioceptive input. These are kids who tend to either be crashing into things all the time. They seek out deep pressure. They have a hard time registering that. So they're running and crashing into things, or they're climbing, or they're bouncing up and down all the time. They're seeking that kind of proprioceptive input to give them an awareness of where their body is, how their muscles are connected to their body. So that's another important one. And then the vestibular sense, which is our sense of balance, where our head is in space.
Okay.
Anyone who's ever had a dizziness episode or a vertigo episode or car sickness, or you know, going on a merry-go-round and not feeling well, that's your vestibular sense. And some kids are highly sensitive to that. Even a little bit of spinning or swinging or car rides make them very dizzy and off balance. And some kids with sensory processing issues can do that over and over and over and over again for hours and never get dizzy. These are kids who are spinning, or they're out on the swing, you know, for long periods of time. They are, you know, under responsive to that. They need a lot more of it. So I mentioned those 2 aspects of sensation because those are some of the things that parents often notice, like, why is my kid spinning around all the time? Or why is my kid constantly like crashing into things? Or why does my kid get in bed and want every blanket and stuffed animal and like everything on top of them? Those are some of the things that we can look for to say, you know, maybe there's some sensory processing kinds of challenges going on there.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I was gonna make you tell us the other senses, so I'm glad.
Yeah.
Like we can't just leave them hanging. There's senses I don't know about. So I'm glad you covered those.
Yes.
And it's so, I mean, it's evident how parents and teachers can see that kind of behavior and say, oh, like this child is disruptive, he's disrespectful,
Absolutely.
or she can't
That's right.
control herself.
That's right.
And they're just seeking more because they're not processing enough, basically, of
That's
what's
exactly
coming
right. You know, kids are remarkably resourceful in terms of figuring out how to meet their needs.
Interesting.
So when we take the time to watch what's happening with their behavior, often that gives us all the clues and information we need to figure out what's going on there. Because kids do well when they can, right? No kid wakes up in the morning and goes, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm just going to try to create every problem possible for everyone. They don't do that, right? Kids want to please, they want to do the right thing. When they're struggling, it gives us cues if we're able and willing to watch for it to say what's going on here. So kids in the classroom who can't sit still, or who are falling out of their chair all the time, or who are constantly getting up and, jumping up and down, or pacing back and forth, or avoiding certain things, right? That gives us information in what's going on in the brain, and then that helps us to be able to know what kinds of strategies can we use to help with that.
Sure. I feel like those kids are often dumped into an ADD, ADHD bucket.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing you're saying these are a bit separate when it comes to psychology?
Yeah. Really, a lot of the things that end up getting called ADD or ADHD are actually several different things going on there. Many kids with ADD or ADHD have some degree of sensory processing, not all, but most of them. Same thing, autism spectrum kinds of kids. Many kids who are diagnosed with, disruptive mood disorders or oppositional defiance, like behavioral kinds of disorders, there's often a sensory processing component to it.
Okay, and so then best practice to help these kids is to tackle each individual issue in the appropriate way. Sure.
That's right.
So obviously as a kids cooking teacher, someone who talks a lot about feeding kids healthy food, we got to talk about food. Is it, where is the cause and effect, or effect when food comes into play here? Yeah,
there's food issues sort of on both sides of the equation. Okay. So first of all, we know that what we eat impacts everything about how we feel and how we function.
We know that.
Yes.
Not everybody gets that.
We know that.
Say that one more time for us, Dr. Beurkens.
The things that we eat impact everything about how we feel and function, and there is so much research about that. I often speak about the food-mood connection. Because when we put junk in our bodies in the way of food, we end up getting junk out. Junky behavior, junky mood, high anxiety, irritability, those kinds of things. So we know that the quality of food matters. And really what it comes down to is the nutrients. Because everything that allows our brain to function in terms of neurotransmitters in our brain, which allows us to process sensory input, which regulates our mood, our anxiety, our behavior, all of that, those neurotransmitters, what are they formed from? Nutrients. So when we don't get the right nutrients in the right amounts, it really impacts neurotransmitter function, it impacts brain function, it impacts physical stuff in the body. And a lot of times parents aren't aware of the connection between, mental health and the brain and food. They think more about, well, my kid's constipated all the time, or my kid's complaining of, feeling nauseous, or my kid has reflux, or whatever. Well, those things play a big role in how the brain functions and mood too. Think about it. If you have a little kid or even an older kid who's walking around totally constipated all the time because of the stuff they're eating, what's their mood like? What's their behavior like? How can your sensory processing work really well when your brain's really focused on the fact that you're not feeling well, right? So food connects to all parts of how we function. And for kids with sensory processing issues, there's a few things going on. One of the things that we know is that many kids with sensory processing issues are low in certain specific nutrients. Okay. And the two that I'll mention for people to really look into are zinc and iron. Zinc and iron are both really important for our sense of taste and smell. So for example, when I have kids who come in who, think everything smells bad, don't want to tolerate tastes, or the opposite, they don't even notice smells, of anything. When I see things like that, I think about zinc. And I'm looking at testing for zinc, seeing what their zinc levels are, and very often they will come back with very, very low zinc levels. And when we replete or get more zinc in them, then their sense of smell, their ability to appropriately perceive and process smell and taste improves. Their appetite comes up, all of that. And iron is big for that as well. Okay. So those of you who have children with some sensory processing issues, picky eating patterns, maybe their appetite's not regulated well, definitely look at zinc and iron. So that's on the one side of the nutrition piece. The other thing that happens nutritionally and food-wise is when kids are not appropriately processing sensation around food, they get avoidant of it, right? This smells bad. This doesn't feel good in my mouth. I'm struggling to move this around and chew and swallow it, or I don't like the taste of this. And what happens then is they develop a lot of avoidance patterns around new things. It's kind of like, here's the little group of things that I know feel comfortable to me and that I can feel confident if I eat them, they're going to feel okay in my mouth, or they're going to smell or taste okay to me, and I'm going to stay away from everything else because it's scary and it might not be, a comfortable experience for me, and so they really become avoidant. And that's how kids' diets really get limited, and then what we end up with is nutrient deficiencies, right? Because I'm eating chicken nuggets and French fries and mac and cheese and pizza, and that's my diet, because that's what I'm comfortable with, but you can't get the broad range of nutrients that you need to function from those kinds of foods. So it becomes sort of this cycle where nutrient deficiencies exacerbate the sensory processing issues, but then the sensory processing problems exacerbate the feeding issues, and you kind of get this cycle.
Yeah, wow, that is such a challenge for parents. I mean, a challenge for kids too. Like you said,
absolutely.
They're not waking up trying to be the problem child. The thing that breaks my heart, really, about picky eaters is just very much that cycle. A lot of parents think, I can't get them to eat anything healthy. It's always a problem, so why even try? How do you take a parent from chicken nuggets, pizza, mac and cheese to getting them into some colorful vegetables, dare I say?
Right, yeah. I think the first thing is to really manage our own expectations as parents appropriately and realize that this is a process. It's not going to happen overnight, and I think where a lot of parents get really discouraged is they've tried at some point to get their kid to eat something different, right? But what happens is if I take a kid who's comfortable with their, few foods and I say, here's a spoonful of broccoli, dump a big serving on their plate, you have to sit here until you eat it. Well, that's going to end up in a power struggle. That's even if the kid does eat it, they get really uncomfortable with it, they're going to be resistive, and it's just unpleasant for everyone involved. So parents then tend to say to me, well, I tried, but he won't do it. So we really have to understand that it is a process, and it's a process that starts with exposure. Because if our expectation is that a kid's going to start eating new things right away, for many picky eaters, that backfires. Now, I should say there's a difference between kids with picky eating preferences and kids with true feeding disorders. Kids with picky eating preferences have a good amount of foods in their diet. They may turn their nose up at things, like they don't prefer to eat certain things, but they have a range of foods that they eat. Kids with feeding disorders have an extremely narrow range of foods, like less than 20 foods total that they eat. Maybe very brand specific, maybe presentation specific. They'll only eat them if presented a certain way. So it's important to know that there is a range of kind of what we're referring to as picky eating. And certainly kids with feeding disorders, most of them really do need and benefit from specific therapy around how to overcome that. But in general, the process for all of these kids is exposure initially without the expectation of eating it.
So wait, treat picky eaters by not asking them to eat?
Yeah.
Just clarifying.
Yes, yeah, because, putting things out there and exposing kids and expecting them to tolerate the exposure so that they can get used to the sensations of that is part of paving the way for them to get comfortable with eating it. So a picky eater might really freak out or get distressed or really resistive about, putting a piece of broccoli in their mouth. But if we start by saying, let's go to the farmer's market and let's check out different kinds of produce. For a little kid, I'd say, let's see if we can find 5 green things here at the farmer's market. Picking things up, looking at it. This is broccoli, touching it, smelling it. If I'm making it in the kitchen at home, involving the child in that. Involving kids in food preparation, shopping, cleaning up is one of the best ways to work on acclimating them and getting them comfortable to new foods. It's not just about going right to the eating. So that's why I love the things that you do and that you promote, because that exposure is so key. When a child's in the kitchen helping to cut things up, helping to cook things, helping to serve things, put things on the table, what are they being exposed to? The smells, the sights, the sounds, all of those kinds of things related to it. And as they are exposed to it more and their brain is able to take in that information and get comfortable with it, then what happens is they're naturally less avoidant, and they're more willing to move towards those steps of maybe, trying a little bit of it, or licking it, or something like that. We move them in the direction of getting comfortable with eating it. And I've had kids with sensory processing issues and related kinds of disorders who parents have been amazed. They're like, my kid would never eat that, and suddenly I had him help me cut it up and put it in the oven, and I put a little bit on his plate just to have it there, not to make him eat it, and next thing I knew, I looked over, he was trying it.
It's the best.
So it's the not pressuring initially, it's the exposing, it's the involving kids in the process of getting used to the various senses related to that stuff, and then that paves the way for more comfortable eating. Now, of course, there's different strategies and things too, like if you're really just dealing with a picky eater, not a kid with a feeding disorder, but a picky eater who would really just prefer to have their mac and cheese and pizza, but there aren't other reasons why they can't eat other things, then you do some of the common sense things like, here's how much you can have of that, and then we're also going to have this much. Or if you'd like to have, X, Y, or Z thing, this is what we're going to eat first.
Sure.
And there's common sense things too, like what you keep in the house makes a difference. Parents will say to me, all he'll eat is, cheese popcorn and suckers and Tostitos chips. And it's like, well, that's coming into the house somehow, and it's not your 6-year-old going to the store and buying it. So sometimes what we do as parents is start to narrow what's available, right? It's like, I'm just not going to bring the suckers into the house anymore. Right? There's other things you can choose or not, up to you. I'm not going to force you to eat something, but I'm also not going to easily make lollipops available to you. Or if it's a kid who really is, constantly eating chips or something like that, we can strategically use our purchasing decisions and what we keep in the house as a way to help move them towards better choices. So, those kinds of things work well too when you combine them with safe, positive exposure to food.
That's great. Those are hard words for parents. I mean, that's kind of what I say in my presentation too, is like, I have some hard words for you.
That's right.
If you're playing into the game, you can't expect positive changes to happen. So I love that you said that too. And really, I like that you said too that the exposure may be more than once. It may be many times before anything actually goes in the mouth. Because I do have a lot of parents who will say, well, I know other parents who say if you have them cook it, they'll eat it. It didn't work for me. And so I'm happy to have this in my tool bag and say, don't worry, just keep doing it.
That's
you don't have to expect them to eat it the first time or every time.
And here, from a neurological standpoint, is something that's important for parents to know. It takes the brain at least 10 exposures to be able to truly make a decision about whether it likes something or not.
The brain. Because we hear that a lot.
That's right.
You have to introduce foods 10
That's
times.
right.
I always
That's
figured
right.
it was more of a
Well,
taste.
it can be from, but that's all the brain,
brain.
because the brain is interpreting the taste, right? Taste is nothing without the brain's interpretation.
That's true.
Of that.
Because one person
That's
and
right.
another person
That's
completely
right.
different opinions.
Which
about
is
food.
also why I have many parents who will say, oh, I don't eat any of those things. Which there's a modeling part of this too, right?
Yes,
if you want your kids to eat their vegetables, you need to eat your vegetables.
Yeah.
But as adults, we've built up all kinds of stories about what we eat and don't eat and what we like and don't like. And it's funny because I'll have parents say, oh my gosh, I tried that way back when I was little and swore it off, and then when I have them try it again now, they're like, actually, I like it.
Yeah.
It's like, right, because your palate has expanded and changed over time, and you discover that you actually like something. So the rule of thumb is you have to try something at least 10 times before your brain can even know what it thinks about that. And that's the exposure and the processing of the different elements of taste and smell and texture. And so a kid might say the first several times, like, oh, no, I don't like that. And you say, that's okay. That's all right, because we're gonna, work on it 10 times, and then you can decide what you think. And you know what? Sometimes we do decide we don't like something. Sure. That's totally okay. But it's that idea that this is a process and the brain needs exposure to eating it in order to see what it thinks. So that 10 times rule is based in the neuroscience of it.
That's awesome. And 10 times is like, that's for you and me without any sensory processing issues.
That's right.
So a sensory processing kid might need
Absolutely.
more than that, or some more smell opportunities,
That's
or some
right.
more touch opportunities.
Lots of exposure leading up to that. 10 times with the taste, right? We may have exposed you dozens of times through helping with the shopping and putting the things in the bags and cutting things up and washing things and serving other people things, even if I'm not going to eat it, serving some to myself to be exposed to it, right? I may need a lot of exposure with that, and then I maybe can start to move towards tasting it and then seeing over 10 times what my brain really thinks about that.
Right. Oh, so interesting.
Yeah.
One of the strategies that I offer to parents for kids who don't even want that classic no thank you bite is give them a second option of smell it, lick it, or taste it.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm excited to know that that's brain science behind my little brainstorm.
Absolutely. Any kind of exposure, because what we're doing there too is we're not allowing kids to get locked into these rigid stories about I don't like that. Or I don't do that. That's right. Because we create all kinds of stories in our mind, and it's like, well, we're gonna put it on your plate and you can touch it, you can lick it, you can smell it, you can play with it. I'm a big fan of when it's appropriate, letting kids play with food. Especially with younger kids, let them play with food. Instead of using Play-Doh, let's use mashed potatoes. Let's make faces out of our food. I'll do a lot of that, in the clinic. Our feeding therapist here does a lot of that stuff. That's a great way of using imagination, getting some playtime in, building structures, with different kinds of foods, all of that type of stuff, because it's all good exposure and it's not anxiety producing. Because we're exploring and we're playing, there's no expectation that what's on your plate is going to go in your mouth.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Do we need to give kids who are having trouble processing those senses more concessions or fewer rules than other kids?
Yeah, I think that's really the exposure piece and being patient with it. A kid who really is just having picky preferences but isn't truly having feeding issues as a result of that, we're going to hold them a little more accountable and maybe set firmer boundaries than we will. And there are kids with feeding disorders who literally will not eat if we put firm boundaries in place.
For days.
Days. Yeah. That's not a lot of them, but that can happen. And there are some parents who are saying, that's my kid. Yeah. And so that's not an effective strategy, and that's not what we want to do. So you kind of have to tease out where your child falls with that. That's certainly more the exception than the rule, but there are those kids. So, my thing is if it's turning into meltdowns, power struggles, it's not working. So whatever boundaries you have in place, you want to back those up a little bit and say, okay, what's the next layer back that we can go as far as exposure? So if a kid is freaking out even about having something that they're not familiar with on their plate, it's like, okay, that's fine. We're just going to have the serving bowl next to you then, or we're going to put a little bit on a plate next to your plate. So it's kind of like if you've pushed it to the point where they're really distressed and it's a big locked in power struggle, that's not helpful. No. Back up a little bit. Back up to the point where maybe they don't really like what you're doing, but it's not causing a big issue. That's right. And then you start there and you say, okay, that's my sweet spot. They're a little bit uncomfortable with this. They prefer for me, to not be pushing this, but they're not freaking out about it. Yeah. That's your sweet spot where you start and then you move from there.
That's cool. What I think I hear that you're saying is that the expectation that you're going to still try 10 bites of broccoli is the same for all kids. It's just some kids need a lot more steps.
A lot more steps. And for kids with true feeding disorders, we're talking about a couple of years steps. Like for us at the clinic, what we say to parents, if they have a kid who comes in with an extremely restricted diet due to a feeding disorder, that's generally a 2-year process to get them to be a comfortable eater. Comfortable meaning they don't need to bring their own food everywhere they go. They have enough variety in their diet that they're able to meet their physical growth needs with the food that they're eating. It is a process for those kids on that end of the spectrum who really have very restrictive avoidant patterns around eating and are truly feeding disordered. Picky eaters, kids with picky preferences, it can be a much quicker process than that, but it's about setting the expectation of what you decide needs to happen now and being consistent with that, and then when we've achieved that, then we keep moving with it.
Yeah, and what a relief, honestly, for parents to hear. Like, I know parents of the pizza, pasta, chicken nuggets people, and they're bringing their own food, they're stressed. The parents are very stressed about brands and presentation.
That's right.
That's not good.
No.
That's not good for the parents. We know it's not good for the kids.
That's right.
To say, hey, you know what? It might take 2 years, but you can do this. You don't have to say, my kid will never eat broccoli. No, your kid's going to eat broccoli 10 times.
Right.
It's just going to take
It's going to take
2
a
years,
while.
and that's
And maybe it won't be broccoli.
Right.
But it is possible for kids to get fruits and vegetables into their diet, for them to get all of these things. It's just, it's a process with it, and it's realizing, I think it's important for parents to understand that some kids don't just grow out of this. We have teenagers and young adults who come here who have been eating the same microwavable meal every single day at school because that's all that they can do.
Sure. So don't assume that time will fix it.
No, especially if it's a feeding disorder, if it's that less than 20 foods, brand specific, presentation specific, that is not going to fix itself. Picky eating preferences, sometimes kids, over time they do, but still, the thing about food and eating, yes, it's to get nutrition, yes, it's a necessary thing, but it's also a social activity, right? So when kids are growing up with really, scary stories in their head around food and really restricting and having picky preferences, it does impact them socially. They can't just go to the birthday party and have fun, or, it impacts their relationships as well. So there's lots of reasons why it's important to work on this.
And also, like you said, the iron and zinc, getting that balance can help solve some of the sensory issues. But are there other kind of like superfoods or foods to avoid that can help kids holistically in their body and in their psychological processes?
Absolutely. In general, things with lots of sugar, things with chemicals, artificial sweeteners are very toxic for the brain. For some kids, it's the artificial dyes. In the foods that can really cause some of these kinds of processing dysfunctions, if not cause them, make them a lot worse. Certainly things like high fructose corn syrup and sugar. Who doesn't prefer those things? Right? Our brain is wired, they're addictive to us. They're addictive to us. Some of the chemicals like MSG that are added to food, they're added because they have an addictive impact on the brain. So we're all prone to that. But if we're trying to expand our kids' eating preferences, their nutrient intake, we need to watch for how much of that stuff we're including in their diet, because we may be at odds with our mission, right?
Sure.
It's like if I've got a kid who's a real sugar addict and wants that stuff all the time, and I'm fueling that, that is impacting their appetite, it's impacting their brain function, it's impacting their sensory processing, and it's going to make it a lot harder than to work on the things that we need to work on with eating or anything else. So certainly, where we can make shifts towards less processed foods, home-cooked meals, things like water instead of soda pop and sports drinks and sugary juices all the time. Doesn't have to be complicated stuff, but any shift that we can make in those areas is going to help a child's brain and body function better, and it's going to make the process of helping them to tolerate and accept new foods much easier. So I think a lot of parents are really surprised to find that when they start taking out some of the things like high fructose corn syrup or some of the chemicals or the dyes or things, they're surprised to notice a difference in their kids' behavior, right? And they would say, oh, I didn't even realize that was happening. Well, we just get so used to how they are, and we don't realize, oh, they're actually less irritable when we take those things out. So I really encourage parents to look at that and to just say, what would happen if? What would happen if we didn't have, gummy bears and things like that, on a regular basis? What do I notice with my child? Just having a curiosity about that and trying it. I think parents are pleasantly surprised to find that even basic things like that can have an impact on their kids.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it can be so hard to get the kids on board. I love to tell parents, just be science geeks about it.
Yes.
Make a little chart and do a science experiment, and you're the focal point. What happens if we cut out colors for 5 days or whatever?
Right. Yep.
And just see what the kids think about that and see how it goes.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and getting kids curious about it and saying, maybe it won't make a difference. Let's find out. And then they feel like, oh, this is interesting. Let's see. I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, we love too at Kids Cook Real Food, of course, to get kids interested in food and in the kitchen. And if you could just recap again, because this is even news to me, how much exposure can impact kids and sometimes how many times it takes. Totally fascinating to me. So getting kids in the kitchen, new reason on me.
Absolutely. Getting kids in the kitchen is so beneficial for supporting improving their diet and getting them comfortable around new foods, especially if you have a child with sensory processing issues, autism, ADHD, any of those sorts of neurodevelopmental issues that have a tendency to impact, comfortability around eating and new foods. Being exposed in the kitchen is awesome. And the thing is, cooking, teaching your kids to cook, involving them in the kitchen has so many benefits. It's like hitting a lot of birds with one stone, right? It's like, okay, I'm getting you comfortable around new foods, but I'm also teaching you really important and valuable life skills. And I was telling you about a new study that came out that said that teenagers and young adults who have cooking skills do better in terms of their own health and healthy eating and things as they get older. So it's sort of like we know that common sense wise, but we've got studies now that say that's the case. So teaching them valuable life skills that they can take with them, and you've got the togetherness aspect. In the busyness of life, we often don't spend enough time just being together, talking to one another, doing real things together. And cooking and food prep and all of that stuff in the kitchen is a great opportunity for that too. So to me, cooking and doing food-related things with your kids hits so many of those important areas for their development, in addition to getting them more comfortable with new foods.
That's so great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Beurkens. Can you just let people know where to find you online, because you have both the physical presence here in Michigan and online?
Absolutely. So the website for the clinic is horizonsdrc.com, and there you can find information about what we do here, and we work with families throughout the country and around the world with various types of things that we do. You can read about what we offer and my team, and we've got lots of articles and things on there too. And then my drbeurkens.com website has tons of articles and videos and things about these topics and more, so people are welcome to take advantage of any of that.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking with you. Just the depth and breadth of your knowledge is amazing, really looking at the whole child, and we'll definitely make sure that those links are anywhere we share this video so that people can find you online. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yep.